Okay, if you're keeping score at home, this is session two of Soul Care with Stevie Boy. Uh, we're going to talk today a little bit more about what we talked a little bit about last time, and that is what it actually takes for us to be able to reliably understand and interpret what the Bible means by what it says. And it comes down to this, that if we don't have some kind of a grasp of, at least an elemental grasp of ancient history, we don't have a way of contextualizing the things that are said there. If we don't understand how life went back when the document that we're studying was written, we kind of come into that thing with one hand tied behind our back. So learning to think through what was life like, what was the world like when Philippians was written, because that's a book I've chosen for us to go through. That's the question we kind of want to begin tugging at today. And let's start here with what was the normal kind of family and what was life generally like. This is such a big, huge subject. There's a fabulous book, a big old thick book by a guy, an old dead guy, whose name was Alfred Edersheim, and he wrote a book called The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. It's not quite a commentary on all of the Gospels, and yet it kind of is, but he does a masterful job of describing what life was like in Jesus' day with Jesus people. We kind of want to do that same thing. I've got to tell you, Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah is, I don't know, about 1,500 pages long. I'm not going to go into it that deeply. I'm going to kind of hit the high points, because if we can get a hold of some of these high points, I think it's going to open up some understanding of what the New Testament, and the Old Testament for that matter, can bring to us. I mentioned last session, session one, that what often happens is when people don't have the contextualization of ancient history, we tend to look at Scripture through the lens of our own experience. This can cause a lot of problems because our experience is not the same as the experience of those to whom the book was written in the ancient times. What we want to try to do is figure out how can we interpret our life through the lens of Scripture, letting Scripture speak to us, and the principles that we find there, the truth that we find there, the wisdom that is there informs us about what does that mean for how I live my life today. So let's think about what was life like in the first century. Most scholars are fairly well agreed that the latest that you can date the book of Philippians would have been about AD 61. Since we believe that Jesus died at about AD 33, you can see this is in the first generation of Christians, because these first 30 some years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and the beginning of the church on the day of Pentecost, we're talking about a fairly tight timeline, especially when you think in terms of ancient history. Now, AD 61 was not very much different than the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to be honest. Certainly not very much different than the days of Joseph when he was in Egypt and rose to power there. The Egyptians had some amazing, almost unexpected kinds of technology that they had developed and refined, and those things then crept over to the rest of the known world at that time. So by AD 61, there were some technologies that were available to some people. Now, here's the thing about ancient cultures, especially the Greco-Roman culture in which the New Testament was written. There was no middle class in the Greco-Roman world. In the Roman Empire, there were the rich and there were the poor. I suppose there was a third group that you would call the very poor, but either you were of the aristocracy, and that meant you were rich, you had land, you had property, you had slaves, you had an income, and to be honest, it was such that you probably didn't have to work because you had other people working for you. The rest of the world, the other easily 3/4 of the world, and some people say it was even a bigger discrepancy between those that were rich and those that weren't. However you want to slice it, the majority of people lived day by day. And there are a lot of reasons for that. If you think about it, one of the reasons is they had very few ways of preserving food. And so you purchased what you needed for that day, the day that you would use it. And some things you could purchase and then use a few days later, but not many days later. If you bought meat, you'd need to use it quickly or else it would spoil. Bread, which was the staple of the ancient world, bread would get bad pretty quickly as well. So, okay, here's the thing. Nobody went to Costco. Nobody went to Walmart. You went to the local merchant that day for what you needed for that day. It kind of gives a little deeper meaning to the phrase Jesus used in the model prayer where he said, "Give us today our daily bread." Okay, boy, I got on a tangent there. I'm going to be careful because I'm giving myself only 15 minutes and I've used half of it already. So, all right. One of the technologies that is maybe one of the most important ones is, who would think of this? It has to do with this. How long was a day? Well, a day was 24 hours then, just like it is now. But here's the thing. How many useful hours of the day were there? Well, essentially, there was from sunup till dark. Those were the hours that you could work. Now, yeah, they had lamps, and most of them were, they used olive oil as the fuel for the lamp. But olive oil was not free. It wasn't ridiculously expensive. But when you're living on a shoestring day to day, you don't need a lot of extra expense. So there weren't very many households that lit themselves up at night with their oil lamps because it was an expensive proposition. So when the sun went down, you had the light of the fire in the hearth. You had perhaps one or two oil lamps, but it wasn't like you could flip on a switch and the room was illuminated. Just thinking in those terms, you realize that the people went to bed early and got up very early, and then they worked all they could within the daylight hours. Well, if you think about the passing of time in conjunction with that, you realize, okay, there were no mechanical clocks. Of course, there were sundials and there were hourglasses and things of that nature, but time was not accounted by the minute. It was accounted by the hour or by the portions of a day. And that sets up a pretty interesting dynamic. We live in a culture that has time broken down into nanoseconds, so that every moment is accounted for and or accountable. And they didn't live that way. They lived by the hour, by the portion of the day, people wouldn't say, "I'll meet you at 3:30." They would say, "I'll meet you in the afternoon." Okay, that sets up a little bit of a cultural thing that we can't relate to very well. And that is they had a less stressed, less compacted, their view of time was not like ours. Uh, I'm not sure very many of them had a to-do list other than we're going to have to serve meals and we've got to do certain things for our livestock and for our children and for whatever our occupation was, but not the kind of 30 things on a to-do list you're going to get done today. Occupationally, the world was still very agricultural. Many people raised their own, obviously, fruits, vegetables, their own livestock to a degree. There were things that you would go buy, and there were all kinds of ways to get that in the ancient world. But again, simple, simple, simple. Life was less driven, it was less complicated and less complex, and in some ways, even a little less demanding. Well, okay, other technologies. There was running water. The Roman world is famous for its public baths. These were sometimes very elaborate, and at other times, well, from what we can gather, they were like, just public pools. Um, if you get the privilege of traveling into the ancient world and seeing these things, even today, 2,000 years later, the ruins and the rocks and stones that were used to make these are still there. So the Romans had figured out construction that would last. They did a pretty good job with that. One of the things that they built was roads. In fact, some of the roads that the Romans built are still in use 2,000 years later. Yeah, they're a little bumpy, but they're still there and they're still in use. Why roads were important factors pretty largely into the book of Philippians. In fact, it factors into all of the epistles of the New Testament and the growth of the church. Here's why. There's an old saying that said, all roads lead to Rome. And in century 1, that was almost literally true, because what the Romans did is they built roads that would leave from and return to Rome so that the Roman legions could be transported to the outer edges of the empire. It was in a similar way that President Eisenhower decided and promoted and then had the interstate systems built. The real purpose of the interstate highways is not to make it easier for us to get from Kansas City to Omaha. It's for the transportation of troops so that if there was a national emergency that required troop transport, they could quickly get on an interstate without stops that is more or less straight and get from position A to position B. That's kind of the concept behind the Roman roads. Why that's important is because Paul and all of the apostles had to have a way to get from Jerusalem to the uttermost parts of the earth. And these Roman roads gave them that as an opportunity. The last thing I want to talk about today, and then we'll shut it down, is mail. There was a mail system in Rome, but it was used for official business. Now, if I wanted to write a letter to someone in another city, I would have to find someone who was either going to that city and would carry the letter, or I would enlist someone to take my letter specifically to that city and to that person. So it was more like a messenger service than a mail service. That matters because it made the the mailing of and the carrying of all of Paul's letters much more difficult than in our day, where you write a letter, put it in an envelope, throw a stamp on it, and put it in a box, or you just click it up on the computer as email. There are so many technology differences that between our day and Paul's day that make a difference that I could spend probably 2 hours. And if we had this back and forth dialogue, we could think out loud about it and add another 2 hours to the whole discourse. But here's the big bottom line, I suppose, is the world was very much different. Life was very hard. Life expectancy was considerably shorter. Infant mortality was much higher. The world was in some ways an easier place because it was much simpler, but in other ways, a much more dangerous and hostile place. There was brutality in terms of military conquest. There was no Geneva Convention. It was ugly. It was, in fact, horrible. If you saw the movie Gladiator, you saw some of what was probably fairly accurate to what happened in those days. So why that matters is because in episode 3 coming on after this next, I'm going to talk about getting into the actual book of Philippians, but you need to embed it in this historical background. I suggest that if you are highly interested in this, just Google ancient history, and especially Google any of the epistles of the New Testament and historical background for any of Paul's writings. Some of it you'll find very interesting. Some of it is kind of blah, yeah, wah, but take what you want and leave the rest. And next time we'll get started looking into the book of Philippians. But I'm going to tell you, we won't start with Philippians. We'll start with another book in the New Testament because that's where the origins of the church at Philippi are. So, till I see you next time, I am gratified that you joined and you thought out loud with me, and I hope that your soul care, which really comes from when we connect with God through His Word and His world and His people, I hope you get even more healthy all the time, and look forward to seeing you next time.